When did you stop trusting the fun parent? My daughter and her best friend are besties for life. One time I asked my daughter, Maggie 8, if she wanted to get married, and she said, "Mommy, I'm already married." To Stacy, Greg, Stacy's dad, was the fun parent who built blanket forts until midnight and made pancakes shaped like their initials. Maggie literally counted down days until her next sleepover there. But then the next invitation came and Maggie said she was too tired, which seemed odd for a kid who never stopped moving. The following week, I found Stacy's mom's invite about Saturday's sleepover crumpled in Maggie's backpack, hidden under her library books. When I asked about it, she mumbled something about forgetting and wouldn't look at me. That same day, I found a camera in her bag, one of those expensive digital ones, and when I asked where it came from, she froze. "It's for a class project, Mom." "For what class?" "I don't know, just leave me alone," she screamed. It was the first time she had ever raised her voice. In weeks, Maggie went from my little tomboy who lived in dinosaur shirts and thought brushing her hair was optional to suddenly begging for pedicures, asking if she was pretty enough, obsessing over scented lotions at Target. She stood in front of the mirror for 20 minutes one morning just staring at herself. And when I asked what she was doing, she said, "Making sure I look right." She was 8. When Stacy's mom called about the upcoming sleepover that Friday, Maggie overheard and started crying so hard she couldn't breathe, just ran to her room and slammed the door. The next Monday at school, pickup changed everything. Greg waved from across the parking lot like always, calling out, "Hey, Maggie!" And my daughter grabbed my hand so tight her nails dug in, hiding her whole body behind me. Her entire body was shaking. In the car, she kept checking the mirrors to make sure his car wasn't behind us. She wouldn't wear her favorite dinosaur shirt anymore, the one she'd worn twice a week for months, saying she needed to look grown up because she was almost an adult. I also noticed she suddenly had money, random dollars in her piggy bank she couldn't explain. "I found it," she'd say. But none of it made sense because an 8-year-old doesn't just find $50. When my husband and I gently asked if Mr. Greg had done something, she shook her head so violently I thought she'd hurt her neck. She just kept saying, "No, no, 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 no," over and over. More things kept appearing in her room. A magnifying mirror I'd never bought, concealer from a brand I don't even use, so much nail polish she could open a salon, and these homemade friendship bracelets but weird ones with beads that spelled out words like pretty and better. She started weighing herself every morning on our bathroom scale, asking if she looked fat, sucking in her little belly. One day I tried to look at the photos on that camera. Maggie grabbed it and threw it against the wall so hard it shattered, screaming, "Those are private!" We talked to Stacy's parents and they were devastated. Greg kept saying, "I don't understand. We were buddies. We built that rocket ship out of cardboard last month." But Maggie was specifically terrified of him. Not Stacy's mom, not Stacy, just Greg. One day I found her crying in the middle of her bedroom, having a breakdown about how she got a blister on her foot from new shoes. None of it made sense. Until one day, when I stayed up with my ear against my daughter's door. I didn't know what I was looking for, but then I heard the click of a camera. I immediately barged in. "Mommy, I'm sorry, please don't be mad." Bile rose in my throat. My 8-year-old daughter was sitting on the floor, taking perfectly posed pictures of her feet. I immediately ran over and pulled her into a tight hug while she cried into my chest. "Greg told me you and Daddy needed money. He said that this would help. I'm sorry for being mean, Mommy. I just didn't want to be ugly anymore." My heart broke in two, and that's when she finally handed me the camera. It was a new one. What I saw when I flicked through the photos was worse than anything I could have imagined, and I was going to rip Greg apart with my bare hands. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold onto the camera while Maggie's whole body shook against mine. The photos showed her feet in different poses, painted toenails, ankles turned just so, exactly like the ads you see online, but these were of my 8-year-old daughter. My husband burst through the door and took one look at my face before I mouthed the words, "Call 911, over Maggie's head while she sobbed into my shirt. He grabbed his phone and stepped into the hallway while I held Maggie tighter, feeling her small body trembling against me. The 911 operator transferred him to some special hotline for child abuse, and I could hear him explaining what we'd found while Maggie kept saying she was sorry over and over. They told him not to contact Greg or alert him in any way because it could mess up the investigation, and we needed to keep all the evidence safe. My husband came back and gently pulled Maggie away from me, telling her they were going to make hot chocolate with extra marshmallows. She went with him, but kept looking back at me like she was scared I'd disappear. I grabbed a paper bag from the kitchen drawer and carefully put the camera inside without touching it too much, my hands still shaking so hard I could barely write the date and time on the outside. The broken pieces of the first camera were still in a box in my closet, so I got those too and put them in another bag. 2 hours felt like forever, but finally a woman showed up at our door with a police officer behind her. Deborah Carpenter had kind eyes and a soft voice when she introduced herself as someone who helps kids in situations like this. Detective Jonah Dobson was tall and serious-looking, but he smiled at Maggie when she peeked around the corner from the living room. Deborah asked if she could talk to Maggie in her room where she'd feel safe and comfortable. I watched from the doorway as Deborah sat on the floor with Maggie and pulled out some dolls from her bag. She let Maggie play with them while asking really gentle questions about Greg and what kinds of games they played. Maggie's voice was so small when she said, "Greg said it was our secret game," that I had to grip the doorframe to keep from running in there. Detective Dobson started taking pictures of Maggie's room, focusing on all the nail polish bottles lined up on her dresser. He put on gloves and carefully bagged each item: the mirrors, the makeup, those weird friendship bracelets with words on them. He explained something about chain of custody and how this would help prove what happened to Maggie. That first night was the worst because Maggie wouldn't let go of either of us. She slept right between my husband and me, waking up every hour crying and checking that we were still there. She kept whispering, "Don't let Greg come," and we promised her over and over that he couldn't hurt her anymore. The next morning, Deborah came back with a folder full of information about something called the Child Advocacy Center. She explained it was a special place designed just for kids where Maggie could do an interview that would be recorded so she wouldn't have to tell her story multiple times. The building had toys and comfortable rooms, not like a police station at all. I called the school while my husband made Maggie breakfast and told them we had a safety concern about pickup. The principal didn't ask questions, just said they'd put new procedures in place right away, and Greg's name would be flagged in their system. My husband called his boss and arranged to work from home for the next few weeks so one of us could always be with Maggie. We made new rules like keeping the bathroom door cracked open during bath time and making sure all electronics stayed in the living room where we could see them. Maggie followed me everywhere, even just to get a glass of water from the kitchen. We set up a little nest of blankets on the floor of our bedroom where she could sleep if she got scared. The pediatrician they sent us to was really gentle when examining Maggie, checking for any physical signs while a nurse held her hand. Maggie kept asking if the doctor thought she was pretty, which made my chest hurt all over again. Detective Dobson called to say their tech people were working on recovering deleted photos from both cameras. He said what they'd found already was enough to arrest Greg, but they wanted to build the strongest case possible. We had to buy new clothes for Maggie because she wouldn't wear anything Greg had seen her in. She picked out dinosaur shirts again at Target and for the first time in months didn't ask to look at the nail polish. Every night she'd wake up scared and crawl between us, clutching her stuffed elephant so tight its fur was matting. We stopped using cameras completely. Even our phones stayed face down so she wouldn't see the camera lens. The next morning, Stacy's mom called while I was making Maggie breakfast, asking why she hadn't seen us in weeks. My throat closed up as I tried to find words that wouldn't destroy her world. Deborah had told us to say only that there was an ongoing investigation involving the girls. I heard confusion in her voice when she asked if everything was okay between the kids. My stomach turned as I repeated what Deborah said while watching Maggie push cereal around her bowl. 3 days crawled by before our appointment at the Child Advocacy Center arrived. The building looked more like a daycare than anything official, painted in bright colors with a playground visible through the windows. Maggie's hand stayed locked in mine as we walked through the front door into a lobby full of toys and books. A woman with dark hair and kind eyes walked over and knelt down to Maggie's level. She introduced herself as Nora Santiago and asked Maggie about the stuffed elephant she was carrying. Nora led us to a room that looked like someone's living room with soft couches and more toys scattered around. She explained that she and Maggie would talk in a special room while my husband and I waited here. Maggie looked back at us 3 times before following Nora down a hallway covered in kids' artwork. My husband and I sat on a couch facing a big fish tank, watching yellow and blue fish swim in circles. Neither of us could focus on the magazines on the coffee table or the TV playing cartoons quietly in the corner. Every few minutes, one of us would check the clock on the wall, then go back to watching the fish. An hour dragged by before Nora came back without Maggie, who was still playing with toys in the other room. She sat across from us and explained she couldn't share details to protect the investigation's integrity, but she confirmed Maggie had disclosed concerning behaviors and everything was recorded for court purposes. This meant Maggie wouldn't have to tell her story over and over to different people. Detective Dobson met us in the parking lot afterward to collect the broken camera pieces I'd been keeping in a shoebox. He put on gloves and carefully transferred each piece into an evidence bag, while explaining their tech team was really good. They might recover deleted images that could show when everything started, and help build a stronger case. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Greg asking if Maggie wanted to come to Stacy's birthday party next weekend. My hands shook as I showed it to my husband, who immediately took a screenshot and forwarded it to Detective Dobson. I wanted to throw my phone against the wall and scream at Greg to never contact us again. Instead, I deleted the message without responding while my husband held me as I shook with rage. The next morning, we went back to the Child Advocacy Center for Maggie's medical exam. The pediatrician was a woman with gray hair who spoke softly and moved slowly, so Maggie could see everything she was doing. A nurse held Maggie's hand while the doctor checked her over, looking for any physical signs that something bad had happened. Maggie kept asking if the doctor thought she was pretty, if she looked okay, if she was doing good. Each question broke my heart into smaller pieces as I realized how deep Greg's manipulation had gone. After the exam, Nora sat with us in that same comfortable room and explained what she'd learned about grooming tactics. The friendship bracelets with words like pretty and better were classic ways predators make kids feel special and grown up. All the beauty products and mirrors were meant to make Maggie focus on her appearance and feel like she needed to look a certain way. The money was payment, but also a way to make her feel like she was doing something important for her family. 2 days later, Detective Dobson called while Maggie was at her therapy appointment with the play therapist. He said they'd gotten a judge to sign a search warrant for Greg's house and all his electronic devices. The police would execute it that afternoon, and Stacy's family would find out about the investigation. He warned us to prepare for contact from them once they realized what was happening. Sure enough, my phone rang at 3 o'clock with Stacy's mom's number on the screen. Her voice was broken and sobbing as she told me police were searching her house and had taken Greg to the station. She kept saying there had to be some mistake, that Greg would never hurt anyone, especially not Maggie, who he loved like his own daughter. But I heard the crack in her voice when she said it, the doubt already creeping in. I told her I couldn't talk about it because of the investigation, and hung up while she was still crying. My hands wouldn't stop shaking for the rest of the day, as I kept checking the locks on our doors and windows. 3 days later, we drove to Maggie's first therapy appointment at a building with cartoon animals painted on the windows. The therapist had curly red hair and sat on the floor with Maggie while I watched from a chair in the corner. She brought out a big box of wooden blocks and asked Maggie if she wanted to build something. Maggie started stacking blocks really high, making this tall wall that went almost to her chin. Then she found a tiny plastic doll in the toy box and put it behind the wall she'd built. "She needs to hide from the bad cameraman," Maggie said, and the therapist just nodded and wrote something in her notebook. They played for an hour while I sat there trying not to cry, watching my daughter act out her fear through toys. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. When we got home that afternoon, Detective Dobson called with news about the cameras. The tech people had managed to get pictures off both cameras, even the broken one Maggie had thrown at the wall. He said they found images going back 3 whole months, hundreds of them stored on memory cards. The evidence was enough to file criminal charges, but he warned us the legal stuff would take forever, maybe a year or more before any trial. My stomach dropped hearing it would drag on that long, but at least they had proof of what Greg did. 2 days after that, we had to go to a parent education thing at the Child Advocacy Center. There were 6 other parents in the room, and we all sat in a circle while a counselor talked about how kids react to trauma. She explained that kids might wet the bed again, or have bad dreams, or get really clingy or angry for no reason. One mom started crying when the counselor talked about kids blaming themselves, and I realized we weren't the only family going through this nightmare. It helped a little knowing other parents were dealing with the same awful stuff. The counselor gave us handouts about warning signs and coping strategies, and told us to be patient because healing takes time. That weekend, we got terrible news that made me want to punch something. Greg had posted bail after his arrest and was out walking around free. There was a restraining order saying he couldn't come near Maggie or our house or her school, had to stay at least 500 feet away. But that didn't feel like enough, so I went to the electronics store and bought security cameras for our house. My husband installed them on every door and window while I downloaded the app on my phone. I checked that app probably 50 times a day, every time I heard a car drive by or the doorbell rang. Maggie started having these awful nightmares where she'd wake up screaming about cameras watching her. She'd run into our room crying that the cameras could see her through the walls. We realized having phones and tablets around was making it worse, so we gathered them all up every night. Maggie helped me lock them in a drawer in the kitchen, and she got to keep the key under her pillow. It was a small thing, but it helped her feel like she had some control over the cameras in our house. About 2 weeks after Maggie told the people at the advocacy center what happened, Detective Dobson called with more news. Another family had come forward about their daughter acting weird after going to Greg's house for playdates. Their kid was only 6 and had started having accidents and crying when they tried to take pictures for the school yearbook. The detective said the investigation was getting bigger, and they were looking at whether Greg hurt other kids too. Part of me felt sick that there might be more victims, but another part felt relieved that people would believe us now. A few days later, Deborah called to say Stacy's mom wanted to know if the girls could see each other. She'd moved out of the house with Stacy and was staying with her parents across town. The mom wanted the girls to have a supervised playdate at the advocacy center where it would be safe. When I asked Maggie if she wanted to see Stacy, she got really quiet and picked at her fingernails. "What if she's mad at me for telling on her dad?" she asked. I told her Stacy wasn't mad and missed her friend, but Maggie still seemed scared. We decided to try it anyway because the therapist thought it might help both girls. The playdate happened the next week in a special room at the advocacy center with toys and art supplies. Deborah was there, and so was a therapist, both sitting in chairs while the girls sat at a little table. At first, neither girl said anything. They just colored on big pieces of paper with markers. Then Stacy said really quietly, "My daddy went away," and Maggie looked up at her. "He was bad to me," Maggie said back, and Stacy just nodded and they kept coloring together. They didn't play like they used to, no giggling or making up games, just quiet coloring side by side. After that, we had to meet with the prosecutor, a man named Chandler Lee who wore a gray suit and had a briefcase full of papers. He explained the charges they were filing against Greg, something about making exploitation material and endangering kids. The words made me feel sick, but I tried to focus on what he was saying about the process. He said Greg could get up to 20 years in prison if convicted, but warned us that these cases usually end in plea deals. Most of the time, the bad guys get way less prison time than they deserve because trials are hard on kid victims. He said we should prepare ourselves for that possibility, even though it wasn't fair. Later that week, my husband found crackers and juice boxes hidden under Maggie's bed when he was tucking her in. There were granola bars in her closet, and fruit snacks stuffed in her dresser drawers. When we asked her about it, she started crying and said she didn't know why she was doing it. The therapist explained it was about control and feeling safe, that kids who've been through trauma sometimes hoard food or other things. We decided not to make a big deal about it and just started leaving healthy snacks in a special basket in her room that she could have whenever she wanted. 2 weeks later, Chandler called my cell while I was making lunch and told me Greg's lawyer wanted to meet about a possible plea deal. The lawyer was saying his client wanted to avoid a trial to spare everyone the trauma. Chandler explained that trials with child victims were really hard on the kids because they had to relive everything. He said we should think about it carefully, but the decision was ultimately ours. My husband and I sat at the kitchen table that night after Maggie went to bed and talked in circles for hours. We wanted Greg to get the maximum punishment, but we also didn't want to put Maggie through more pain. The next afternoon, I went to check on Maggie in her room and found her sitting on the floor surrounded by all her dress-up clothes. She had the safety scissors from her art box and was cutting each dress into tiny pieces. Pink tulle from her princess costume covered the carpet like confetti. She looked up at me with tears running down her face and said she didn't want to be pretty anymore. I sat down next to her and helped her cut up the rest without saying anything. Later, the therapist explained this was Maggie's way of taking control and rejecting what Greg had made her believe she needed to be. She said it was actually a healthy sign that Maggie was processing her feelings. 3 months crawled by with meetings and paperwork and phone calls from lawyers. Then we had to go to the courthouse for something called a pre-trial hearing. My mom came to watch Maggie while we went, but at the last minute, the victim advocate said Maggie could wait in a special room at the courthouse if she wanted to come. Maggie said she wanted to be near us, so we brought her coloring books and snacks. The advocate took her to a room with toys and a TV while we went into the courtroom. That's when I saw Greg for the first time since finding out what he did. He sat at a table with his lawyer wearing a gray suit that looked too big on him. He seemed smaller than I remembered, like he'd shrunk somehow. His hair was thinner and his face looked older. I wanted to scream at him, but I just stared straight ahead. The hearing was mostly the lawyers talking about evidence and timelines and legal stuff I didn't really understand. After about an hour, we went back to get Maggie from the kids' room. She was coloring a picture of butterflies and didn't even look up when we walked in. She had no idea Greg had been just down the hall. The judge made a decision that day that changed everything for us. She approved using Maggie's interview from the Advocacy Center as evidence if the case went to trial. This meant Maggie wouldn't have to sit in court and answer questions from Greg's lawyer. The relief hit me so hard I started crying right there in the hallway. My husband grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight. We wouldn't have to watch our baby girl get interrogated about the worst thing that ever happened to her. A week later, Deborah called with news about Stacy's family. The mom had filed for divorce and moved out of their house to stay with her parents across town. She'd taken Stacy with her and enrolled her in a new school. Deborah read us a letter the mom had written, apologizing for not seeing what was happening. She said she was getting Stacy into therapy and promised to do whatever it took to help her daughter heal. The letter made me cry because I could feel her pain through the words. She was a mom too, and her whole world had exploded just like ours. Around this time, Maggie's school counselor called with something that made my heart feel less heavy. She said Maggie had been spending recess time with younger kids who seemed sad or left out. She'd been sharing her snacks and teaching them how to draw butterflies. The counselor said it showed that despite everything, Maggie's natural kindness was still there. It was the first real sign that the sweet girl we knew before this nightmare was finding her way back. Then Chandler called with news that made me physically sick. The forensic team examining Greg's computers had found evidence that he'd been selling some of the images online. This changed everything because now it became a federal crime. The FBI was joining the investigation, and Chandler explained this was actually good for our case. Federal charges meant Greg would face much more prison time if convicted. The thought of those pictures being out there somewhere made me throw up in the kitchen sink. My husband held my hair back while I sobbed and dry heaved. That night when I went to tuck Maggie in, I couldn't find her in her bed. I checked the bathroom and then heard a small sound from her closet. She'd made a little nest in there with her blanket and pillow. She looked up at me and said the closet felt safer than her bed. Instead of trying to convince her to move back to the bed, we decided to make the closet as cozy as possible. The next day, my husband strung up battery-powered twinkle lights, and I added more pillows and her favorite stuffed animals. We put a little battery lantern in there so she could read. If the closet made her feel safe, then that's where she could sleep. 2 days later, we got a call from a lawyer saying Greg's parents wanted to meet with us. They were offering money, a lot of money, if we would agree to ask the prosecutor for lesser charges. The lawyer said they were prepared to pay for all of Maggie's therapy and medical costs, plus additional compensation. My husband hung up without even discussing it with me. There wasn't enough money in the world to make us help Greg avoid consequences for what he did. We called Chandler right away to tell him about the offer, and he said it showed they knew Greg was guilty. 4 months had passed since that horrible night when I found Maggie with the camera. We'd settled into new routines with therapy twice a week and check-ins with Deborah. Maggie still slept in her closet and still wouldn't wear anything that reminded her of before. But that morning when we were getting ready for therapy, she came out of her room wearing something I hadn't seen in months. It was her dinosaur shirt, the one she used to wear twice a week, the one she'd hidden in the back of her drawer. She looked at me nervously like she was asking permission. I had to turn away so she wouldn't see me crying happy tears for the first time in forever. The therapist saw me wiping my face and gave me a small nod while Maggie settled into the play area with blocks and dolls. That same afternoon, Chandler called about another family coming forward, whose 6-year-old daughter had been to play dates at Greg's house, and started showing similar signs like asking if she was pretty enough, and having unexplained money in her backpack. The mom had found photos on her daughter's tablet that made her call the police immediately, and now they wanted to join our case, which Chandler said would make the prosecution much stronger. We met them at the prosecutor's office 3 days later, and their little girl was even younger than Maggie with the same scared look in her eyes that broke my heart all over again. The mom grabbed my hand in the waiting room and we both started crying without saying anything because we understood each other's pain without needing words. Detective Dobson pulled us into a conference room the next week with news that made everyone in the room go silent. The forensic team going through Greg's computers had found evidence of 3 more potential victims with photos that matched kids from different states where Greg had traveled for work conferences. The investigation was expanding across state lines now, and the FBI was taking over parts of the case, which meant Greg's bail got revoked immediately, since he was now considered a flight risk with victims in multiple jurisdictions. My husband pumped his fist when we heard Greg was going back to jail, but I just felt sick thinking about how many kids he'd hurt. During therapy that week, something new happened that the therapist had been waiting for. Maggie was playing with toy cars when suddenly she threw one against the wall and screamed that she hated Greg and wanted him to go away forever. She kicked the dollhouse and threw pillows around the room while the therapist calmly watched and told us afterward this was actually good progress because Maggie was finally expressing anger instead of just fear and shame. The therapist explained that moving from being scared to being mad meant Maggie was starting to understand that what happened wasn't her fault, and she had a right to be angry about it. 2 weeks later, Deborah suggested we try a support group for families dealing with child exploitation, and even though I wasn't sure about sharing our story with strangers, we decided to give it a try. The meeting was in a church basement with about 15 other families, and while the parents sat in a circle talking, Maggie played in the next room with other kids who'd been through similar things. One dad talked about finding pictures on his son's phone, and a mom shared how her daughter wouldn't sleep in her own bed anymore, and hearing their stories made me realize we weren't as alone as I'd thought. The group leader gave us resources about trauma therapy and legal advocacy and phone numbers for crisis support, and for the first time in months, I felt like maybe we could get through this. Maggie made friends with a girl named Macy, whose situation was similar, and they colored pictures together while the adults shared coping strategies and warning signs we'd all missed. After the meeting, several parents exchanged numbers, and we started a group text for support during the hard days, which happened more often than the good ones. Then Chandler called with news that made my stomach drop, even though I knew it was coming eventually. Greg's lawyer wanted to meet about a plea deal where Greg would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for 15 years in federal prison, with lifetime registration as a sex offender, and no contact with any minors, including his own daughter, Stacy. Chandler explained that this would mean Maggie wouldn't have to testify or have her recorded interview played in court, which would spare her additional trauma, but it also meant Greg wouldn't face the maximum sentence of 25 years if convicted at trial. My husband wanted Greg to rot in prison forever and spent the whole night pacing around the kitchen arguing that 15 years wasn't enough for what he did to all those kids. I felt the same rage, but I also kept thinking about Maggie having to sit through a trial and hear defense lawyers try to make her look like a liar or say she misunderstood what happened. We stayed up until 3 a.m. going back and forth about what was best for Maggie versus what Greg deserved, and finally decided we'd support whatever Chandler recommended since he'd handled hundreds of these cases. The next day in therapy, Maggie worked on something the therapist had suggested called a body safety poster, where she wrote rules about her body belonging to her, and nobody being allowed to touch her private parts, and no keeping secrets about touching. She decorated it with stickers and markers and hung it on her bedroom wall right next to her dinosaur posters, and seeing her take back some control over her own body made me cry in the hallway where she couldn't see. 5 months had passed since I'd found Maggie with that camera, and she came to us one morning asking if we could get a dog for protection because she still got scared at night when she heard noises outside. We went to the animal shelter that weekend, and Maggie walked past all the puppies and stopped at a cage with a golden retriever who'd been returned twice for being too calm and boring. She sat on the floor, and the dog immediately laid his head in her lap, and she looked up at us and said, "His name was Guard, and could we please take him home?" Guard slept outside Maggie's door every single night and followed her from room to room like he knew his job was keeping her safe. 3 weeks later, Chandler called to say the plea deal was moving forward, and Greg would formally admit guilt in court next Monday, while we could watch from a separate room on closed-circuit TV, so Maggie wouldn't have to see him. We sat in that small room holding hands, while on the screen Greg stood in an orange jumpsuit and said yes, when the judge asked if he'd produced inappropriate images of multiple minor victims for distribution. Hearing him actually admit what he did out loud made it real in a way that all the meetings and therapy sessions hadn't, and I threw up in the courthouse bathroom afterward, while my husband held my hair. The next day, a letter arrived from Stacy's mom saying she was sorry for everything that happened, and that Stacy missed Maggie and didn't understand why they couldn't play together anymore, But she didn't blame Maggie for any of it. Maggie wanted to write back, so she dictated while I typed that she missed Stacy too, but needed more time before they could be friends again, and maybe someday when she felt better they could play at a park with both moms there, but not yet. 3 weeks after that letter, we started family therapy at the place downtown, with the big windows and toys in the waiting room. The therapist had us all sit in a circle on these blue cushions on the floor, and my husband went first, saying he kept having dreams where he found Greg and beat him with a baseball bat. He said it so calmly, like he was talking about the weather, but his hands were shaking. I told them about checking on Maggie 20 times a night, and how I kept replaying every play date trying to figure out what signs I missed. Maggie just played with the sand tray in the corner, making little walls around a tiny plastic girl. The therapist said trauma affects whole families, and we'd work through it together, but I could tell my husband wanted to punch something when she said Greg's name. We went every Tuesday after that and slowly started talking about normal things too, like Maggie's grades and my husband's work stress. 6 months after I found Maggie with that camera, she signed up for the school talent show, which shocked us since she'd been avoiding any attention. She picked this song about being brave and practiced in her room for weeks with guards sitting outside her door. The night of the show, we sat in the front row and watched her walk onto that big stage in her dinosaur shirt and new sparkly shoes. Her voice shook on the first line, but then got stronger, and by the end she was belting out the words about standing tall. Nobody in that auditorium mentioned why this mattered so much, but when she finished, the whole place erupted and people stood up clapping for 3 whole minutes. Some parents were crying, and the principal gave her an extra big hug when she came off stage. 2 days later, we got the call from Chandler about Greg's sentencing hearing, and he said we could watch from a separate room again. We dropped Maggie at the school that morning, and she asked to look at butterflies in the garden outside while we went in. The courtroom was packed with other parents and investigators, and Greg stood there in his orange jumpsuit while the judge read through all the charges. The judge called his crimes an unconscionable betrayal of innocence, and said society had a duty to protect children from predators like him. He sentenced Greg to 15 years in federal prison with no chance of early release and lifetime registration as a sex offender. When we picked up Maggie, she was still watching those butterflies and asked if the bad man was going away forever, and we said yes for a very long time. The next week, we got paperwork from the FBI Victim Services saying they'd cover all of Maggie's therapy and medical costs related to what happened. It was such a relief since insurance kept denying claims, saying therapy wasn't medically necessary, even though Maggie still had nightmares most nights. The funding meant we could keep seeing the good therapist who understood trauma, instead of whoever insurance would cover. During one session, Maggie's therapist brought out special paper and markers, and suggested she write letters to her younger self. Maggie started writing to the little girl she used to be, telling her it wasn't her fault, and she didn't do anything wrong. She drew dinosaurs on one side and butterflies on the other, and the therapist said this showed she was starting to integrate both parts of herself. Every week, she'd add another letter and decorate them with stickers and glitter. 7 months after everything started, Maggie asked if we could go shopping for new clothes, but she wanted to pick them herself this time. We went to Target, and she spent an hour looking at everything, touching different fabrics, and holding shirts up to herself in the mirror. She picked out 3 dinosaur shirts and 2 pairs of sparkly sneakers, and a dress with butterflies on it. At checkout, she said she wanted clothes that felt like her, not like what other people wanted. That same week, we got official notice that the court ordered Greg's house and cars and savings to be sold, to pay restitution to all the victims. The money would go into a trust for Maggie's future education and therapy needs, which meant something good would come from all his evil. The lawyer handling it said there was enough to cover years of treatment plus college someday. Maggie's regular therapist introduced something called EMDR, where she'd follow a light with her eyes while thinking about the bad memories. It sounded weird, but after 3 sessions, her nightmares went from every night to maybe twice a week. She started sleeping in her own bed again instead of on our floor, and guard would lay right beside her bed all night long. One morning, she came to breakfast and said she slept all night without waking up once. Around this time, the other families from the investigation started a private group text, and we'd share updates about our kids. When one mom said her daughter was scared to go back to the school, we all shared what worked for us. Another dad said his son started playing sports again, and that gave us hope. We met for coffee once a month while the kids had group therapy, and it helped knowing we weren't alone in this mess. 8 months after that horrible night with the camera, Maggie came to me asking if she could have a birthday party with kids from the school. She hadn't wanted to be around other kids much except for therapy group, so this was huge. She said she wanted a dinosaur theme, and could we have it at the park with the big playground. We started planning, and she made a list of 10 kids to invite and picked out dinosaur plates and cups. She even wanted to help make the cake and said it should be chocolate with green frosting. The day of the party came faster than I expected, and I spent the morning hanging green streamers while my husband set up tables in the backyard. Maggie helped frost the cake with thick green icing and stuck plastic dinosaurs all around the edges, while guard watched from his spot by the door. Cars started pulling up around 2, and kids ran through our gate carrying wrapped presents and wearing dinosaur shirts, just like Maggie requested on the invitations. She stood by the door for a minute before running out to meet them, and I watched her shoulders relax when they all started talking about the decorations. The kids immediately started a game where they pretended to be different dinosaurs, and Maggie joined right in as a T-Rex chasing the smaller ones around the yard. Her friend Macy roared so loud the neighbors looked over their fence and Maggie actually laughed. Not a polite laugh, but that real belly laugh I hadn't heard in so many months. My husband grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard as we both heard that sound fill our backyard like it used to. More kids showed up and they split into teams for dinosaur battles where they had to act out different prehistoric creatures while the other team guessed. Maggie was right in the middle of it all, making up silly walks for a brontosaurus and falling over dramatically when the asteroid hit. About an hour into the party, I saw Stacy's mom's car pull up and my whole body tensed, but Maggie had asked if they could come for just a little bit. Stacy got out holding a small wrapped box and walked slowly toward the backyard while her mom stayed by the car. The two girls looked at each other for a long moment before Maggie walked over, and they hugged quickly and carefully like they might break. Stacy handed her the present and said something I couldn't hear, then went to sit at a different table with some other kids from their class. They played at separate ends of the party, but every once in a while I caught them looking at each other with something that might grow into friendship again someday. Stacy's mom waved at me from the car, and I nodded back, knowing we all needed more time before anything could be normal. After cake and presents, the kids went home sticky and tired, and Maggie collapsed on the couch still wearing her party hat. That night at bedtime, she sat up suddenly and told us she decided what she wanted to be when she grew up. She wanted to be a police officer like Detective Dobson who helped kids and made them feel safe when bad things happened. We told her she could be anything in the whole world, and for the first time in months, she really seemed to believe us. The next morning, she brought us the poster she'd made in therapy with her body safety rules written in purple marker. She wanted to hang it in the hallway where everyone could see it, so other kids would know the rules too if they visited. We found a frame at Target and hung it right between the family photos while she watched. She asked if she could add one more rule and wrote, "I am brave and I am safe" at the bottom in green marker. She decorated all around it with dinosaur stickers on one side and star stickers on the other, like she was putting both parts of herself together. 2 weeks later, she started 3rd grade and I was so nervous dropping her off, but her new teacher already knew about the accommodations from the counselor. The first parent-teacher conference, the teacher pulled me aside to tell me Maggie had been helping the shy kids at recess. She'd notice when someone was sitting alone and invite them to play or share her snacks with kids who looked sad. The teacher said it was like Maggie had radar for kids who needed a friend, and I knew it came from her understanding what it felt like to hurt. Our Saturday mornings changed too, because pancakes shaped like initials made her freeze up and stop eating. Instead, we started making them in animal shapes with Maggie picking which animal each week. She'd stand on her step stool and help pour the batter into shapes like elephants or giraffes or her favorite velociraptors. It gave her control over something small but important, and I watched her confidence grow with each choice she made. One evening while I was doing dishes, Maggie came into the kitchen and asked if bad people ever get better, or if they stay bad forever. My husband and I sat down with her at the table and talked about how some people do bad things and have to face consequences. She thought about it for a while, then said Greg had to stay in timeout for a very, very long time because what he did was very, very bad. It was such a simple way to understand justice, but it made perfect sense for an 8-year-old trying to process something so big. Every night I tucked her into bed with Guard laying right at her feet, keeping watch. She'd wrap her arms around my neck and tell me she loved me bigger than all the dinosaurs that ever lived, even the really huge ones. We weren't completely better, and maybe we never would be exactly like before, but we were moving forward together one day at a time. Each morning was a little easier than the one before, and that had to be enough for now. That's the takeaway from today's story. Hopefully it gives you something useful to tuck in your back pocket. If you want more tips and lessons woven into stories, subscribe so you're always a step ahead.